All right, hello. Can you hear me? Are we all good? All right, fantastic. So thank you so much for joining me. I watched some of your debates earlier, and I'm very much looking forward to debating you on this. I will be taking the pro side of should Social Security be privatized, and my name is Dan Johnson. I'm going to go ahead and get started. Americans are rightly concerned today about Social Security and whether or not it will be there for them, whether or not the purpose of the program will be fulfilled. In a survey of American workers released just this March, only 37% said they were somewhat or very confident the Social Security system would continue to provide benefits of at least equal value. And they're not wrong, because the first big problem with Social Security is right now it's leaving people behind. According to the Senior Citizens League annual buying power report, Social Security benefits have increased 43% since 2000. That sounds great, until you realize that cost of living has jumped 86%. While most major publications agree you can't live on your Social Security check alone, we're actually reducing the buying power of the people receiving those checks as they stay on the current system. Also, as people are getting older who are paying into the system, we're robbing them. For the first time since 2010, because people are living longer and thus those generations who are working are having to pay more into the system, a couple that turned 65 in 2010 would have paid $600,000 in taxes as an average income earner. They would only collected $579,000. We are robbing our existing generation. And then finally, imagine if one day you woke up and you turned on the television and your employer said you were fired. Not only were you fired, but you were fired immediately and there would be no chance of collecting unemployment. Well, that's what our elderly have to live with every single day under Social Security. Because Social Security is bankrupt, Barack Obama told Scott Pelley at CBS in 2011, I cannot guarantee that those checks go out on August 3rd if we'd ever resolve the issue relating to the debt ceiling, because there simply may not be money in the coffers to do it. Do we really take care of our older generation by leaving them hanging by a thread like that? I don't think so. And with the deficit of Social Security exceeding $70 billion in 2016, according to the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget, and it is at #1 priority on the Republicans' target list, including Paul Ryan, of reforming and raising the entire retirement age and cutting benefits, leaving people hanging, our most vulnerable hanging by that thread, is just plain wrong. When you have a government trust fund, it's the same as having a government trust fund. Quite frankly, when we leave our money in the hands of bureaucrats and expect them to give it back to us in 40 years, we see how well that worked. And I'll be talking about the benefits of privatization versus that. Thank you very much.
All right, I have a question for you before I get going. Which portions of the Social Security program are you planning to privatize, and what functions of those programs?
Sure. So the portions of the Social Security program we privatize. It would be a eventual 100% privatization that starts very small. So it starts with a small opt-out program where young people today are allowed to opt out, a voluntary opt-out of paying into half of or a quarter of their Social Security, then half, then 3/4, then eventually you move it down the bandway. And secondly, that because those are existing obligations of the federal government that they've promised, it's not an entitlement program, it's not anything like that. Because there's existing obligations, you divert money from other potential spending to the obligations the government already made to cover the existing retirees.
So you're essentially getting rid of the pay-as-you-go Social Security system and replacing it with individual retirement accounts?
Transitioning slowly toward getting rid of it, correct.
All right, I got a cat here who wants to be on the video. Okay. Well, let me tell you what I think about this question. Social Security should not be privatized. This is a terrible idea. Privatizing Social Security is dangerous and it's irresponsible, and let me tell you why. First, massive corruption. Politicians must select and provide oversight to private companies who are going to take over Social Security responsibilities. These companies would have access to a $2.84 trillion slush fund. This is just short of the value of Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, Facebook, and Google combined, according to TechCrunch in July 2017. Political corruption is most rampant when politicians control the fate of private companies and private money. This allows private companies to have an incentive to bribe and control politicians in order to give them a bigger slice of the pie. We see this in military spending and any other area where the government has oversight of large private organizations. It's dangerous management. Profit motives demand riskier investment strategies that benefit the company, and those they invest in. That's dangerous for retirees. Private companies can milk the system and abandon it when it collapses, leaving the public and the government in ruins. Profit motives lead to denied claims and eligibility, which is a big part of the Social Security Administration. And privatization has failed us in the past. We went to privatize mental health. We used to have a decent mental health system in the United States. We privatized it, and now there's homeless people on the streets. It's a national crisis that we hear in the news over and over again. It's also bad for national security. These companies who are controlling and involved in the Social Security Administration could end up being bought by foreign companies or by foreign governments, because that's the way corporations work. Just like 20% of our uranium production is now in the hands of Russians because of this kind of privatization. Now, also, the U.S. debt holdings, which are currently in Social Security, if they're moved into another area, would represent a huge movement of debt into foreign governments who buy about half of the U.S. debt holdings. That would increase their holdings of U.S. debt. First, I want people who are listening to this date to think about non-unique benefits. Any benefits unique to privatization, only benefits unique to privatization can be claimed. Any policy change that the state could conceivably carry out on their own is a non-unique benefit to privatization, thus out of scope for the decision on whether or not we should privatize Social Security. Let me give you a few facts before we go here. The scale of Social Security. At the end of 2016, the trust fund balance of the account was $2.84 trillion. That's how much money they have in the account in 2016. This is off of the official government site. They are not broke. The concern for Social Security is in the future, in 2034. Its earnings were $88.356 billion in 2016, a 3.11% rate of return on investment, and the cost of the administration was $6 billion.
Okay, thank you very much for the discussion. I want to address a few of the points. Number one, a common assumption when it comes to privatization is that you're going to still fund it through the tax system, but that you're going to hand this funding to private companies instead. You see examples like military-industrial complex, for example, where you fund through taxes, they pay these companies, and these companies engage in massive corruption. This is not, as I indicated before, the privatization I'm anywhere near talking about. The privatization is a gradual phase out where workers are able to take their tax dollars that would otherwise be taken from the Social Security and invest it themselves in the private market, over time transitioning to a fully worker-run and worker-driven system. So that eliminates, I think, all claims of the corruption through privatization. Again, we're not giving private companies control. We're just not taking people's money in the first place. Secondly, denied claims. I don't know of a single denied claim when an investor went to cash out an investment. Those result in, if they have ever happened, have resulted in massive lawsuits, and the companies just don't do that. The claim that the trust fund has $2.8 trillion is actually easily destroyed. Those $2.8 trillion, the claim of the people in the trust fund, doesn't make any sense because the trust fund was 2.6 supposedly under Barack Obama. And Barack Obama said, well, we may not be able to send out the checks because we may not have the money. Well, if you have 2.8 trillion in the trust fund, how can't you send out the checks? Well, here's why. The trust fund is invested in government bonds, which means for every dollars that the dollars you're paying into Social Security, most of them are going to current retirees if you're paying in. But about $100 or so, $1,000, depending on where you're at, is going to the U.S. Treasury. And the U.S. Treasury is basically spending that anywhere in the general government, military spending, wherever, and submitting an IOU to the Social Security Trust Fund saying, if you need this money in the future, please come get it. Now, this works well as long as Social Security is, actually running a benefit instead of a deficit. But as I said before, regardless of the earnings that he just mentioned, which I'm not going to challenge, on top of those earnings, how much Social Security had to pay out was a deficit of $70 billion in 2016, projected to be significantly more than that as time goes on and the population ages. Now, I want to bring up the question of only benefits unique to privatization can be claimed. If the benefit can be done better under privatization, or you can have a better benefit under privatization versus that under the public system, then obviously that would be a benefit that could be claimed. And I will make those claims a little bit later on as I'm running out of time for this segment.
Well, we're a little bit in dispute of facts. I went to ssa.gov, which is the official site for Social Security. The trust fund has grown every year on year since the inception of the program, and this year it grew by $6,229,000,000. I'm sorry, it earned $88.356 billion. That's over the amount that they had in expenses. That's why the trust fund continues to get bigger, because right now more people are paying in than people are taking out. That is going to change in the future. And it's one of the biggest flaws of your plan. Now that we've heard it yet, but I've heard the broad strokes, you're going to move people out of the Social Security system, meaning they stop making Social Security payments, and they're going to go and put that money into their own accounts, just like an IRA, something we already have and anybody can already go and do, which makes the benefits of it entirely non-unique. But let's get back. You're going to take out the income that's coming into Social Security Trust Fund. That is going to deplete the revenue. Meanwhile, all the people who paid into it in the past, whose money went out to previous retirees, are going to be drawing on the fund. You're going to drain that fund into the ground far faster than you ever would. You'll have elderly people in the streets far faster than you would in 2034, which is the current projected time when it runs down to zero. So you're going to destroy Social Security by taking out the money that goes into the system and still paying it out into retirees. The money you're not paying out that's going into the private trust funds won't be useful to anyone until 40 years down the road. By then, the entire system is going to collapse for all the people that paid into it and have a guaranteed trust in the government. It is illegal not to give them the money that they're due in the Social Security system. And you are, taking a fast track to completely destroying it. It's a terrible, terrible idea. If you're just interested in higher rates of return, it would be possible for the government to invest in private commodities and stocks if you want to get a higher rate of return. That's something you could do under the government system. You'd have to change the law because currently you're not allowed to do that, but it's certainly possible. And thus you could get the same benefits from a higher rate of return on the other system. You talk about bonds. Bonds are investments, just like private securities that you get with your IRA or your 401k or any other investment you make. It works exactly the same way. They don't take that money and stick it in a ball somewhere. They stick it out on the markets. They get returns of investment. They have constant money flowing in. And when they need to pay out, they make sure some of that income that comes back in goes out to the people that they owe money to. That's exactly how Social Security works as well. The quote that you read, I think, was badly misinformed or has something to do with some other system. Social Security has never failed a payment, and it won't until that trust fund runs out in 2034.
Okay, thank you very much. So I want to address several fallacies. Number one, the idea that you're calling it a trust fund and you're treating it like other trust funds is kind of interesting, because a trust fund basically works where you're placing a certain amount of money in trust of someone else that eventually is going to come to the beneficiaries. Think of a college trust fund, right? You're placing money and then your kids are going to get that money later on. But the Social Security Trust Fund, actually, according to the Office of Management and Budget, they said the balances are nothing more than, quote, a bookkeeping device. It is to tell how much Social Security is owed, quote, they do not consist of real economic assets that can be drawn down in the future to fund benefits. In effect, as I said, the Social Security Trust Fund operates by basically sending the government the U.S. Treasury sends them an IOU, and then they store the IOU as if the government is going to be able to pay them. Well, right now, the only way the government could ever pay them is if they either raise taxes or significantly increase the debt, again, placing more burden on future generations. And I want to address a couple of things. The idea of retirees, drowning in the streets because we're not paying for them. As I said very specifically, the phase-in plan of this is whether you're a person or a government, if you've already made a promise to someone, you have to fulfill that promise before making any additional obligations. And the way the Social Security Trust Fund should work, or the way the Social Security system should work, rather, is as we're doing this phase out, as young workers are not being robbed anymore because they're paying more into the system than they're possibly getting out, as they're no longer being robbed, as they're going into better rates of returns in the investment market, they're actually going to be able, the federal government is going to move money away from future obligations, such as discretionary spending, military spending, things like that. We spend more than 27 countries, next 27 countries combined in military spending, but it doesn't matter. Anywhere where they do not have a specific obligation and they have money to spend, they're going to move that money to those retirees because you address your obligations before you make any new ones. That is the privatization plan that I'm talking about. And finally, guaranteed trust in the government. This is thing brought up by Social Security advocates all the time, that the government's always trustworthy, et cetera. Well, as I pointed out with the Social Security Trust Fund, and you can look up yourself, as I pointed out with the trust fund from the Office of Management and Budget, trust fund has no real economic assets. So basically, it's like Bernie Madoff coming up to you and going, hey, man, you need to keep investing here because, man, if you go out there, you could lose it. When you've already lost it, where it's already gone, and even as my opponent mentions, it's a side point, but my opponent mentions it's going to be insolvent eventually. So why don't we just not worry about those old people and only worry about people today? I think that's the wrong way for our society to go. I want to briefly mention the rate of return in that the three things that benefits privatization. Number one, it adds certainty. Number two, it gets money out of the hands of bureaucrats. Number three, it delivers better results, and I'll go on those later.
Sure, yeah, I'd like to hear more about that later. You know, honestly, I feel like I need to school you on how financing works. You know, when you invest money in either a private company or when people buy bonds, because private companies and you can get retirement accounts that also buy U.S. government bonds, you give the money to somebody else, you lend it to them, and then they're obligated to pay you back. And you do that so that you can make a return on your investment. So your money just isn't sitting there getting eaten away by inflation. And hopefully it grows. That's the whole idea. So there is no difference whatsoever between the way the government invests the Social Security Trust Fund and the way private companies would invest individual retirement accounts, except that the government is required to use only the very, very safest, most solid debt obligations in the world, that is U.S. government bonds. The U.S. government has never failed to pay its obligations. It's like the Lannisters. It always pays its debt. It has the highest credit rating on the planet. There is no better, no safer, no other investment you can make that is guaranteed to give you your money back, plus the interest rate that they promised. So whoever those people are, they do not understand how finance and banking works. It's very simple. The government doesn't do any kind of magic that other people don't do. What you're planning to do is to take money away from the current system. The way Social Security was set up in the first place, they wanted to help elderly people right then. So they couldn't, well, we're going to save up money. So then elderly people in 60 years and 40 years, well, then they'll have retirement. No, they needed to help people retire right now. So that's why it's a pay-as-you-go system. The current population pays into the Social Security fund. That fund pays out to the people. The surplus is then invested. That's the way it's always worked. Ways always will work. And because it's making more money than it turns out, there has been no problem whatsoever with that so far. You can't just suddenly stop pushing money into the system and expect to pay it out. You said, oh, well, we'll just take it from other parts of the budget. Yeah, what are you going to do? Slash the military in half? Are you going to gut Medicaid? Are you going to, disband Congress? Are you going to? I have no idea where you're going to get that kind of money from. If you really claim that that's possible, you should show some feasibility on that idea. Because basically what's going to happen is the Social Security Trust Fund will go tits up. We're going to have a huge financial crisis because elderly people are not going to be able to get their checks. That's going to cause instability and chaos on the stock market. It is a terrible, incredibly irresponsible idea to just say, oh, we'll get the money from somewhere. The government's got lots of money, right? Now, the system was set up the way it is. It's been working for quite a long time. It does have some dangers, but these dangers are not going to be solved by shoveling out cash and making it explode twice as fast.
Okay, so I need to address, obviously going back and forth on the trust fund, then I'll come down to sources, I'll drop them in later. Need to address a few things. Number one, when you invest in a private company, if that company goes bankrupt, you are not getting your money back. I'm sorry, that's not how that works. And if the government is not able to pay its obligations, you aren't getting your money back. The Treasury every Thursday goes out and sells government debt in order to have a deficit. Otherwise, they couldn't pay their bills. When they go out and sell the government debt, they're saying, hey, you guys can invest in this. And people are believing right now that they can, but over time, that's getting more expensive. In fact, the claim my opponent made that the government's never failed to pay back its obligations, well, there's $19 trillion in debt sitting right there saying, no, that's actually not how this works. But let's keep going. My opponent attacked the implementation of the plan. He keeps attacking the implementation of the plan. And he talks about, well, we're just going to take money from somewhere. Actually, I am very specific. Number one, not we're letting young people opt out, but number two, with a $70 billion deficit in 2016, according to a Defense Business Board study, if you address the bureaucracy in the military, you would save $125 billion a year. That's just bureaucracy. That's not cutting planes, trains, automobiles, aircraft carriers, anything. If you simply address the bureaucracy, you'd be able to direct that money. That's just the military. There's plenty of other areas in the government where they can start cutting and moving, but the most important thing is the moral obligation. When you make a promise, especially to people who are trusting you with their money, then you have to fulfill that promise before you go and make other promises. That's just a basic moral fact of how we need to operate. But addressing those, and I think I've easily addressed those, and the idea that elderly people will die in the street is a commonly thrown out idea when it comes to social programs. But quite frankly, I think I've addressed it very clearly. That said, I want to talk a little bit about rates of return here. So number one, privatization benefits. Number one, it gets the money out of the hands of bureaucrats. You're expecting bureaucrats to hold on to your money and then give it back to you 40 years at the best rate of return you can get, or at a rate of return that's actually going to keep you, doing well in life. You're not getting that out of the Social Security system. Again, $600,000 in taxes, $579,000 in benefits, robbing people. You don't get out in the private system. Number two, it adds certainty because the government is quite frankly broke. Social Security is broke. Everybody knows Social Security is broke. The OMB admits Social Security is broke. You're getting better security out of a system with 50 or 25 or 10% risk than you are out of 100% risk. And finally, the rate of return, annual rate of return on stocks in the U.S., 6%. That's Cato, Morningstar, 5 and 6%. Heritage, this return Social Security, 1.23%, 1.2%, and 2.7%. There is no.
Actually, according to the Social Security website in 2016, the rate of return was actually 3.11%. That's an established fact that we've given early in the, I don't know where those guys are getting their numbers or what years they're from, but that's the most recent data. Now look, private bankruptcy, you want to talk about bankruptcy. Private companies go bankrupt fairly often, happens from time to time. I don't know if you remember the whole big stock market crash that we had in 2008, where the insurance companies were falling apart, where the automakers were falling apart, where the mortgage companies were falling apart, and the US government, the financial rock of the US system, had to come in and stabilize those businesses because they went crazy making risky investments and destroyed the capital that they were investing for people, causing a huge collapse in the economy, people to lose their homes, problems of this nature. That's what can happen in the private marketplace. It's great for making lots of money. It's not great for being safe. The government, on the other hand, it has never happened. When has the US government gone bankrupt? Never, hasn't happened. It is the most trusted financial institution on the planet. That's why companies all around the world invest in United States bonds, because they know the government can pay them, because the United States is the biggest economy in the world. So they can draw on the taxpayers when they need to. That's how it works. Let's move on to this talk about funding by the military bureaucracy. Oh yeah, we'll make everything more efficient. It's going to be awesome. Yeah, people have been saying that since the beginning of government, since the beginning of politics. It doesn't work like that. You can't wave a magic wand and make money come out of the middle of the air just by focusing on making things efficient. It doesn't work that way. This is the real world. Inefficiency is part of life. The government, I've worked with the government before, are always trying to make things better. They're always trying to get things working on their tighter and tighter budgets. I'm sure there are problems, but you can't just make money appear. Look, private investments are risky. I talked about the failure of the markets that happen from time to time. Social Security is guaranteed by the federal government, the most stable financial institution in the world. However, private investments, while they can go up, they can also go down, down, which could leave these people who leave the Social Security system and fend out on their own with suddenly, money that's just going to vaporize. They also would have the ability to take that money out whenever they like, leaving themselves destitute for Social Security. The Congressional Budget Office estimates that when Social Security was implemented, it lowered the level of poverty among the elderly from 40% in the United States to 10%. And it's stayed there pretty much since for elderly Americans. It has had an incredibly beneficial effect on the United States economy. It has worked incredibly well. We should not take these incredible risks and risk destroying the system that we have for pie in the sky promises.
I want to address what is a fundamental point of my opponent, which is that the government never defaults on its debt. The U.S. government is the never defaults on nations, that it's the best financial instrument in the world, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Well, let's talk a few things. Number one, State governments, people also viewed as some of the safest places to put your investments. And yet, as we saw in the case of Illinois, if Illinois did not pass a massive doubling of their tax rate this year, they literally would have defaulted on not only a lot of their debts, but they were already defaulting on payments to nonprofits that they had contracted in the state to provide public services. In fact, the United States government has defaulted before. In 1979, on April 26th, investors in T-bills were told the U.S. Treasury could not make its payments on maturing securities to individual investors. Again, and then we go on to Social Security benefits. The reason the debate on Social Security benefits has ended with raising the retirement age and has ended with lowering the amount of increase in benefits to keep up with cost of living is because Social Security, quite frankly, could not meet its previous obligations. And that's why senators lowered the program and how much they were taking care of people. So no, as the president of Puerto Rico said, as their country went bankrupt, eventually math catches up to you. And the idea of, oh, well, we just cut it, we'll just, government can never make itself more efficient. Well, I have a friend, John Paul Cook, who happens to be an auditor of federal agencies. And when the US government went from full-time military officers to reserve military officers, they saved billions and billions of dollars per year. And they just did that a few years ago. Now, now that I've addressed the question of, well, is it trustworthy? Well, it's not as trustworthy as they say it is. I want to go back to, again, we're robbing people right now. $600,000 in taxes, $579,000 in benefits. We're leaving people on a thread that they don't know if their checks are going to come and if their checks are going to be enough to live on, more importantly. And we, in the private sector, or in the privatization, if people could have control over their investments, not only could they get the money out of the hands of bureaucrats, which we know has not really worked very well, they could add certainty to their life, going from 100% risk to some risk, but a general average better rate of return, and it delivers better results. Again, average rate of return stocks, 6% from Cato, 5 and 6% Morningstar, 7% other sources. This is why privatization is necessary for Social Security.
Yeah, well, we don't buy state of Illinois savings bonds. We buy U.S. government savings bonds, and there's a reason for that. Yeah, the individual states, some of them are plenty solvent, but yeah, some of them are not so good off. However, the United States government is. Look, anybody who's judging this debate, Google safety of U.S. government bonds, Google America's credit rating, and you will find that we have some of the best credit and the most trusted debt on the entire planet. I want to remind you of all this. He said in 1926, I don't know what incident this was or what the scale of this problem was. He said that some bonds couldn't have paid out interest. Yeah, well, okay, so we've got this one thing. I don't know if people remember the Great Depression of the 1920s, the recession of 2008, the recession during the Bush administration. There were about 4 other great stock market crashes during the 1800s that devastated the American economy. The U.S. government managed to survive all of those in good financial trust and has done so for quite a long time. However, private companies in the stock markets, they come and they go. It's a risky investment. This is a guaranteed program. The idea of the program is to make sure that American elderly people have the money that they need to pay the rent and for food and other basic living requirements in their old age, because stuff happens to people that can wipe out their regular savings. This money is guaranteed. They can't take it out early. They can't fritter it away on lotto tickets. They have to keep it essentially in the government bank. And when they retire, they have a promise from the government that they will get paid. And as he said, yeah, there's an insolvency issue with Social Security. And indeed, the way you do it is either you lower benefits a little bit or you increase taxes a little bit in order to cover it. And generally speaking, we probably have to increase taxes a little bit to cover it. Yeah, again, pie in the sky stuff about increasing efficiency, that's great for the budget of an individual department. But when it comes to the United States budget, it doesn't work that way. These are entitlement programs. They are guaranteed to the American public. You can't just fiddle around with their funding. Pulling people out of the system is going to cut the legs out of the retirement security of millions of American retired people. This is a terrible plan. It's a risky plan. It involves making the United States government weaker by pushing our debt out into foreign shores instead of holding it ourselves. It's a bad idea, and we shouldn't do it. And with that, I will rest my case and end the debate. You should definitely not privatize Social Security. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure debating with you, sir.